"I must ask again. Are you certain?" said a voice behind him. Tal Rashas stared at the binding stone that Tyrion had helped them shape and etch with runes of containment. Tal Rashas had captured Baal in the shard of the Ember Soulstone after a long and ardorous battle, but the Horadric knew the containment of the primeval would be short-lived, unless the shard was combined with a human. Within moments, Tal Rashas would be inextricably bound to the shard, and by extension, to the very primeval he and his brethren had sought so desperately to destroy. The voice addressing Tal Rashas was that of Sultan Kul. He had asked this question first as Tyrion had led them through subterranean tunnels and into these burial chambers of the long-dead kings. He had asked yet again when they had begun to shape the binding stone and forge the unbreakable chains. And now, before it was too late, he was asking a third time. "I am certain," said Tal Rashas, and by saying it, he found that he was. His whole life had been dedicated to justice and light. If he were to balk now, millions would die at Baal's hands, playthings to his greed for destruction. Better that one man should perish than the whole world suffer, even if that one man happened to be him. As Tyrion directed the Horadric in affixing the chains and in the chants that would make the binding eternal, Tal Rashas took a deep breath. This would be his last moment of peace before a half-life of eternal struggle. He felt the manacles tighten around his wrists, felt his arms and legs stretch tight. He closed his eyes and uttered a silent prayer for the eternal light to give him strength to withstand the difficult path he had chosen. When he opened his eyes again, Tyrion was there, looming just before him, the glooming shard held delicately between his fingers. "I am ready," said Tal Rashas. Tyrion nodded once. "So be it," he said, and drove the shard deep into Tal Rashas' being. The pain was enormous. Immediately he was retching in agony, the fire in his chest searing and unrelenting as he felt his body being transformed into a prison for the terrible Baal. He cried out, gnashing his teeth as his Horadric brethren and Tyrion stood motionless before him, watching. "Help me," a part of him wanted to say. "The pain is too great. I was wrong." He bit down on his tongue until his mouth was full of blood, his body shaking and rattling in the chains, the presence of Baal uncomfortable and menacing. So much love of destruction. And this agony, this evil, would be his only companion for not mere days or weeks or months, but years and years. He felt Baal pushing at his mind and body, scouring for weaknesses, shaking the very foundations of his soul. His brothers slowly turned away and filed out. Then came the sound of the stone door grating closed and chanting from the other side as it was sealed with runes. And Tal Rashas was left all alone in the flickering light, writhing, wriggling, unable to catch his breath, hardly able to think, struggling to remember he was human. Only he wasn't alone, exactly. "Why have your brethren abandoned you?" whispered Baal. Tal Rashas tried not to listen. "Why have they left you behind? If they were truly your brothers, they would never have done so. My brothers and I, we look out for one another. True brothers do. Are your brothers so false?" "There was no choice," said Tal Rashas, panting as he forced out the words. "There is always a choice. How is it, after all, you have done to serve them? They allowed you to sacrifice yourself." Tal Rashas could see Sultan now in his mind's eye, as he'd made the decision to sacrifice himself. Was that a flicker of satisfaction he glimpsed, before it was quickly hidden away? Had this been what Sultan wanted all along? "Sultan Kul is hardly as pure as he allows you or the others to believe." Tal Rashas groaned. "No," he said, "I won't listen to you." But whether he listened now or not, it was too late. The idea was already planted in his mind. Why had Sultan done nothing to try to stop him? He could remember the others, the horror and shock on their faces as they realized what their leader had agreed to do. But Sultan's face had been blank, expressionless. Hadn't it? Or was this all wrong? Was he being forced to misremember in a way that Baal's voice resonated in his skull, disrupting his thoughts, sending them swirling away? The others protested, but did he? Did he? He was losing his footing again, seeing only Sultan's cruel face as he stayed silent while the others tried to keep Tal Rasha from taking on the burden upon himself. True, he had never asked Tal Rasha to offer up his own life, but he had never volunteered himself either. Sultan had known that if he waited long enough, if he directed him just enough, Tal Rasha would take the burden upon himself, just as he had desired. But wait, no. Was he remembering correctly? It didn't seem right, but surely it had just happened. Surely it was fresh in his mind. That demonic voice again, more insistent now. Sultan Cool came up with the accursed idea. He could have volunteered himself at any time. He never did. He wanted you to leave, so that he would become the head of the order. This was all an elaborate play to take your place. No, it wasn't true. It couldn't be. It was not Sultan Cool he should doubt, but this whispering, lying voice. Baal. "Begone, demon!" he cried. "I command thee, depart!" For a moment there was silence in his head. No whispering, no other voice, though his body continued to contort and struggle. And then, starting low and rising, he heard Baal's awful laughter. "You fool! I cannot be banished or dismissed. Your very body is the place of my banishment. Our fates are bound together now. You cannot rid yourself of me." He chuckled again, malicious. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and deadly. "Or perhaps I should say, you cannot escape me." The demon stretched, and Tal Rasha felt needles within his skin as the demon again tested the bounds of his prison. He cried out, and his mouth filled with blood. His vision grew blurred and dark. He was panting, exhausted. "Would that I could simply destroy you, that I could trample your body into a slick of blood and bring about your annihilation as I've done with so many. I am not well disposed to patience, particularly when I have no choice." And now, even with his eyes closed, Tal Rasha felt that he could see Baal's cruel mien staring back at him out of the darkness. "I cannot destroy you all at once, and so I will destroy you bit by bit. I will take one part of your mind and crush it, then another, until you are reduced to nothing, until you are less than nothing, an empty shell, and then I will crack you open and crawl out of you." Tal Rasha opened his eyes, but Baal's face still remained, marring his vision like a smear. "What have I condemned myself to?" he asked himself, but he already knew. Despite his love of the light, despite his countless deeds upholding justice, in order to save the world, he had sentenced himself to a living hell. He was filled with infinite regret, a regret that he knew was likely to last forever. But haven't I already been here forever? As suddenly as the vision had begun, for indeed a vision was what it had been. He could see it now. It fizzled away, None of this just happened. By Tal Rashas' estimation, he had already been suffering for a few years. But what was a mere handful of years in the face of eternity? He looked down and saw his struggling body, emaciated and barely human. He felt the eternal hunger that had been with him for nearly as long as he could remember. The thirst that left him forever parched, and always just a hair's breadth shy of death. His body struggled, yanking at its bonds. It both was and wasn't his body now. He knew, and he both was and wasn't the one struggling. In a flash, he knew that the scene with Sultan had been fed to him by Baal, a subtle rework of what had actually happened, with Baal keeping nearly everything the same while nevertheless introducing shades of doubt and fear, making him mistrust himself and his brethren, to weaken Tal Rashas' mind even further and break him apart piece by piece, just as the Lord of Destruction had promised to do. But at least this time, Tal Rasha had seen through it. "You cannot fool me with your illusions, demon."
"And yet I fool you with the same illusion time and time again, mage."
"Each time it takes you a little longer to understand. It is an illusion. Your mind is crumbling, and soon it shall be reduced to ash, and I will be free."
"No," Tal Rasha thought. "You're lying." But deep inside him he knew that it was true, that he had been through this before and yet had forgotten. Baal laughed.
"Another piece of you is gone. There you go, grain by grain, dispersed into nothingness. You, Horadric, with your so-called love for justice, believing that knowledge will be enough to save you. How quaint! Just because you recognize what is happening to you doesn't mean that you can prevent it from happening."
He opened his eyes into darkness, silence. It took a moment for him to realize where he was. What a terrible dream, he thought. The light of the waning crescent moon through his cell window was so dim that he could see almost nothing at all. He groped along the floor beside his pallet until he found the earthenware cup and raised it to his lips, drinking the tepid water. But, strangely enough, as soon as he drank the water and set the cup down, he felt thirsty again. What time was it? Early, no doubt. Too early to be getting up. But after such a dream, how could he sleep? No, better to rise and light a candle and get to work. He had his history to record, the true story of how he had been chosen by Tyrael to be the leader of the Horadric, how he had sacrificed himself to save the world, and now, miraculously, his life had been returned to him, his glory had been returned to him, so that now he was again among the Horadric, the defenders of truth and light, and dedicated to a monastic life of contemplation and wisdom. He rose from his pallet once more and slipped on his robe, then fumbled through the darkness, hands outstretched until his fingers touched the back of his chair. He settled onto it and pulled it closer to the crude wooden table that served him as a desk, then cast his hands carefully over its surface, past the ever-present stack of books, brushing the feathered ends of the quills until he found the candle, its sides stippled with wax drippings. He mumbled a simple spell, and it sprang alight. He arranged a blank half-sheet of foolscap before him. Choosing a quill from the cup that held them, he dipped the pen in ink and began to write. "I found myself in the depths. I was always breaking, but not yet broken. I clung to what I had learned, to the truth that Tyrael had revealed to me, in hope that the bedrock of this great knowledge would be enough to allow me to survive until my fellow Horadric figured out a way to rescue my body. A way to substitute something else as a prison for Baal. Surely Tyrael would find some means to bring the shards of the Ember Soulstone back together, or perhaps the means to carve another prison from what remained of the World Stone. I had to continue to hope, I knew, and I must not, above all, give way to despair. Reaching the end of the page, he drew back, waiting for the ink to dry before he added it to the stack of finished pages at his elbow. He blew lightly on the words to facilitate this, but as he did so, the letters seemed to twist and move, dancing madly in the candle's flame. He shook his head, but the words were still moving, little rivulets of ink darting across the page. Frowning, he peered closer, rereading what he had written. Only a few years into his captivity, Baal, Lord of Destruction, esteemed spawn of one of the primary heads of Tafhamet, had broken the will of the meddlesome mage. The once proud Tal Rashas had become a shadow of his former self, his mind reduced to the residue of impulses that Baal could shape as putty to his will. However, Tyrael's magic could not yet be defeated. Though Tal Rashas' heart had become weakened and diseased, it, combined with the shard, still held Baal imprisoned, and yet it was his jailer who suffered more than Baal himself. For each year he kept Baal imprisoned, it felt as though Tal Rashas suffered in the burning hells for 1,000 years. Soon, Tal Rashas' mind would be gone, and his body would be entirely subject to Baal's will. All the great Baal would have to do was to be patient. But patience did not come easily to Baal. Fortunately, he had his jailer upon which to take out his frustrations. Tal Rashas felt his blood grow chill. He reached for the page to tear it into two, but as he did, he saw that his reaching hand was dark red and scaly, and terminated into sharp grey claws. He lifted it to his face and stared at it, then pushed back the sleeve of his robe. There, too, the skin was red and scaled. He reached up to his face, felt the way his mouth puckered strangely, fingering the tips of the long fangs. His hand traveled upward, touched the curled horns that jutted from the crown of his head.
No,
he said aloud.
It cannot be.
He was imagining things. This couldn't be happening. But then again, how had he escaped? Was that not impossible as well? Unless, perhaps, he had sold his soul and ended up giving in to darkness. Had it gone so far? Was this why he had become a demon? At first, no one responded to his pounding at the locked door, and then, finally, as he paused to catch his breath between shouts, he heard at a distance a door opening and shutting.
Hello?
He called.
Please, help me!
Nobody answered. After a time, he heard the sound of footsteps drawing nearer, then nearer still, finally stopping just outside the door.
Who is it?
He asked.
Open this door at once!
I will not open the door, said a voice that he recognized as Sultan Kul's. His second in command, the very person who he had feared would take over leadership of the order when he had been left alone to struggle with Baal in the tomb. His betrayer.
I command it,
Tal Rashas said, and waited, but still the door did not open. At last, Sultan spoke, his voice tired, exhausted, as if this was a conversation he had had far too many times.
We have done what we can for you, said Sultan. We have, as requested, provided you with writing implementations so that you can record all that has happened to you. We've given you every comfort possible. We've made of your necessary solitude a life of contemplation. Perhaps one day you shall be released. Once we know that we can trust you again.
Tal Rashas felt rage well up within him. How could those who had once served him have the appalling temerity to believe they could control him so? He pounded again on the door.
Release me,
he cried.
Cure me of this curse.
From the other side of the door, Sultan's voice remained calm.
Even if I so desired, I could not.
The door has been meticulously bound shut.
It would take all the Horadric working together to remove the runes of binding. As for your curse, you brought it upon yourself. Return to your desk, record your history, share your wisdom with us. Slide the papers out under the door. We will gather them,
read them, consult among ourselves. Perhaps one day, when the time is right, we will release you." "This is unjust," said Tal Rasha. "By holding me, you are breaking your vow to serve justice." But Sultan said nothing in response. As Tal Rasha listened, he heard footsteps move slowly away, and then, finally, in the distance, the sound of a door shutting. Not knowing what else to do, he returned to his desk. He examined his scaly hands. How had this come to happen? He reached for a quill, and then when he picked one up, it became engulfed in flame, but it only felt comfortably warm in his hand. Just like home, he thought, almost without realizing what that implied. Shall I try again? He wondered. And then, because he didn't know what, if anything else he could do, he lifted the pen and began to write. "I am not sure what has happened to me," he wrote with his burning pen, the air filled with a pungent odor, and he realized that he was writing not on paper, but on parchment made from the skin of an animal. Or rather, he was sure, though he was not sure how he was sure. Not an animal, but the skin of a human. A perfect surface for a demon such as myself, he thought. "Is this real?" he wrote. "Am I still dreaming?" He found himself staring out the window. It was, he saw, still dark outside. It was impossible to see anything, except that same sliver of moon. Once morning came, perhaps he could leap from the window and escape that way. With his free hand he reached toward the opening, but before he could cross its surface, a bluish fire began to play over it, and he found that he could not touch it. Of course, the Horadric were careful and efficient. They would have left nothing to chance. A scratching sound distracted him. He glanced down and saw that while he had been lost in thought, his clawed hand had been idly doodling. There was a face now, crudely drawn, but nonetheless a face. He peered at it, looking at it more closely. It looked familiar. He stared, and then by impulse redrew a few lines, reconnecting others, all to the accompaniment of the smell of burning flesh. He still couldn't quite place the face until, suddenly, abruptly he could. It was the face of Tal Rasha. "That's my face," he realized with a start. "That's who I really am." He reached up and touched his head and found that the horns were no longer there. He looked back at the drawing, but that was gone too. The whole desk was gone, and the cell, too, was fading around him. All that remained was the flickering light of the candle. But it was not from a candle any longer. It was the flickering light that illuminated the tomb. He was back where he had always been, bound to the stone, twisting and turning in endless combat with Baal. But he knew where he was, knew who he was. He had not broken, yet. Baal gave a low chuckle. "You have failed to break me. Again," panted Tal Rasha. Baal hissed.
"I am hollowing you out from the inside. With every failure, I come closer to succeeding. With every success, you come closer to your final failure." "You are a worthy opponent,"
Tal Rasha said.
"But I shall continue to triumph. You, on the other hand, are a fool and a waste of my time."
How many years had it been? 1, 2, a decade, a century. He did not know, nor did he know how much longer he could hold out. An impossible task it turned out, resisting a prime evil. Baal was becoming more inventive, manipulating and pushing his mind more and more effectively, making him more malleable. In the end, he knew he would only be a hollow version of what he had once been, not even close to human. He was already well on the way there. The last vision had been as bad as any. Each time Baal altered his reality, the demon watched carefully for what upset Tal Rasha the most, made careful note of it, and amplified it in whatever came next. "You will never be free," he told himself. "In the end, you will collapse. But even once you do, the binding will still hold. He will still be imprisoned within you. You will still have saved the world."
"If you are to give in eventually,"
came Baal's voice from within his head.
"why not give in now?"
Why not give in now? He wondered. It would bring the torture to a stop. His body tensed and contorted, squirmed, but it had been happening for so long, so many years now, that he almost no longer noticed it. The pain, a constant scream that never dissipated, his vocal cords long gone raw, his hunger perpetual, his thirst too, a true hell. Why not give in? Why not end it? But would it really end? Could he be sure? Once he gave in, perhaps it would simply allow Baal to make things worse. He writhed, breathed through his teeth. He bit his tongue. But whatever blood had been in him was mostly dried up. It came torpidly and didn't last long. How much longer can I survive? Something was nagging at him. What was it? Something felt different. Something was different. And then he realized. One of his hands was no longer restrained. The chain that had bound it had somehow come loose. It was impossible. And yet, no, not impossible. Just improbable. There were, he realized, circumstances where it might just be possible. A syllable mispronounced or skipped when the binding spell was uttered. Perhaps by only one of the Horadrim. Not enough to be noticed in the chorus of voices by Tyrael, but just enough to introduce a subtle flaw. A weakness that over time would cause the rune to slowly fail. Yes, it was just possible. Perhaps that, combined with his increasingly diminished physical body, had been enough to allow him to slip free of one of his chains, even while the others remained implacably in place. His hand could now reach out and grab the shard that was in his chest, could even tug it out if he so chose. How tempting that was, to be free of this torment once and for all, to allow his body, so long tortured, to rest, perhaps even to die. Hadn't he suffered enough? How could any mortal be asked to endure torment such as this? And yet, he had promised to save the world. He had sacrificed himself willingly. If he were to go back on this promise, all that he had sacrificed would have been for naught. No, he couldn't give up. And now he had added one more burden to those already heaping upon him. He must not let Baal know that his arm was unchained. Must not in fact think about it at all. If he did, Baal would wrest control of Tal Rashas' own hand, use it to tug the golden shard free and release him from his captor. He felt despair welling up in him. How long could he keep his secret? One slip and it was over. One slip and he would betray the world.
Something is different,
Baal thought. The arrogant mage, the worm, had become cagey. The vermin was hiding something. Amusing that he thought that he could keep it a secret from him, Tor Balos, who had a millennia of interaction with demons and angels and humans to tell him when someone was trying to deceive him. Baal was sick of being trapped here, with this uptight mage, with his principles and his values, who had somehow convinced himself that the sanctuary would be a better world if it stayed always the same, stagnant, unchanging. Ah, sneered Baal. What fun was that? And what fun was this mage? Both of them knew that he couldn't be holed out forever. And Baal knew too that someday something would change, that the idea that he could be bound for eternity in a place like this was part and parcel of naive belief that things wouldn't change. But things did change, and he would get out. And once he was out, He would pop his arrogant little mage's head like a grape. Then he would devastate this world and everything in it. Kill everything he saw, growing stronger with each act of slaughter. He had a lot of mayhem to catch up on. But what was different now? What was this runt hiding from him? He worked his way into the man's puny mind and found him thinking obsessively about the fact that he was trapped here. That there was no escape. That was nothing new. Mage had been playing intermittently with this one putrid thought for years and years now, turning it this way and that, examining it from every angle. But something about it this time gave Baal pause. Shortly he realized what it was. Tal Rashas never thought with such obsession about his plight. He thought about it, true, but not obsessively. What had shifted? And then it occurred to Baal.
He was trying to not think about something else.
He pushed farther in. The man's mind was so easy to penetrate. Its hallways regular and straight and boring. Nothing dynamic here. That Tyrael had ever thought of this man as a worthy vessel to contain him was incredible to Baal. But then again, the idiot Archangel had always underestimated him and his brothers, and would no doubt continue to do so. He pushed his way through Tal Rashas' mind, looked for dark corners, places where things might be hidden. There were one or two things, moments from his childhood that he kept hidden, perhaps even from himself. Nothing of real consequence, but things Baal filed away as fodder for potential inclusion in the future visions. And then, suddenly, there it was, a newly patched wall, so to speak, mortal still damp, so obvious, hidden in plain sight. It was always a pleasure to make a wall collapse. He prodded on it with his forelegs, and it crumbled inward, and there it was. At first Baal couldn't believe it, but as he sorted through Tal Rashas' reasoning, slowly drawing it out of the man bit by painful bit, he began to believe that, yes, it was possible. The fools! They couldn't even cast a binding spell correctly. And yes, Tal Rashas' worries were correct. He still couldn't escape from the binding, but Baal now could. All he needed was to take control of Tal Rashas' hand and... But the mage proved remarkably resistant. He had clearly been preparing for this eventuality for some time. How infuriating. If he was out of his prison, Baal would simply tear that brat's head from his shoulders and be done with him. They struggled back and forth, with Baal doing all he could to assert his will, until, finally exhausted, Tal Rashas' guard momentarily slipped. It was all Baal needed. He rushed in and took control of the hand, and a moment later, it had closed around the shard that Tyrael had jammed deep within Tal Rashas' flesh. Tal Rashas screamed and fought to regain control, but it was already too late. The shard had already been withdrawn and cast aside. Baal was free. It was exhilarating, being released after all these years. He rushed for the exit. Surely there was some sort of alarm trigger, which would mean that it was only a matter of time before that busybody Tyrael arrived. Hearing behind him the anguished cries of the collapsed and helpless Tal Rashas, Baal nearly doubled back to finish him off. But even he knew that would be reckless. He had to flee while he still had the chance.
Another day, Tal Rashas,
Baal cried, cackling with glee. He would find his brothers, and together they would come back and make short work, first of Tal Rashas, and then of the high heavens. There would be time enough to track down this ruined husk of a man. For now, let him stay bound to the stone, dying his slow and painful death. Baal had to use all his strength to move the stone that blocked the tomb.
Funny,
he thought.
I would have thought they would have bound this place as well.
He remembered from the nightmare he had given Tal Rashas a few years before, but perhaps that detail had been his own addition to the story. He had changed so many small details in the visions he had manufactured that it was sometimes hard to remember what was real. The block rolled away, grinding against the stone, and he stepped into the tunnel beyond. He rushed through it, deserted as it was. He passed other tombs, and now he could hear behind him the sound of Tyrael rising, beckoning after him, searching for him. A good thing that Baal hadn't indulged himself and gone back to slaughter Tal Rasha. If he had, he'd been in the heat of battle right now. And suddenly, there it was, the exit to the outside world. Baal swung the double doors open and rushed out the other side, only to find the inside of the same tomb. What? There was no outside. How could this be? What sort of curse was this? And where was Tyrael? He could no longer hear the sounds of the Archangel's imminent arrival. He pushed through the doors again and found himself outside at last, but surrounded by... what could those be? Cows? But bipedal and carrying polearms. What fresh hell was this? They rushed forward, mooing at him, and with a flick of his forelegs, he sent a wave of eyes to mow them down. They were nothing, easily defeated, and yet they kept coming, and coming, and coming. Troubled, he stepped back through the doors to gather himself and think, and found himself in the tomb again. When, after a moment, he opened the doors again, he found himself looking out upon the inverse mirror of the tomb. Once again, there was no outside.
Did I miss my chance? Which way should I go? Back the way I came, or into its mirror image?
He hesitated. It was not like the Lord of Destruction to hesitate, and yet he did. And then he plunged into the mirror image of the tomb. Slowly, with increasing dread, he crept back the way he had come, following the same path but in reverse, into the backward version of the world. He came at last to the rock he had rolled aside. He hesitated there, not sure that he wanted to see what was on the other side, but at last, not knowing what else to do, he passed through. There, on the other side, still perfectly chained, still impeccably attached to the binding stone, was Tal Rasha. The shard was still anchored deep within his flesh. His body was still contorted in agony as his features flickered back and forth between his human face and the monstrous face of Baal. Baal howled with frustration, to have been made to think that he was free when he had never been free at all. To be bested, he, by a mere mortal, even if only for a few moments. What would his brothers say if they could bear witness to what had happened? And upon thinking that, he found himself not standing observing Tal Rasha, but back with the crystal, back within Tal Rasha, his fleshy prison, trapped. Despite his pain, despite his state of perpetual agony, Tal Rasha smiled. He had, for once, given Baal some of his own medicine. The victory was pyrrhic and fleeting, but he had managed to preserve a tiny piece of himself. Perhaps he could hold on to sanity for a little longer after all. But then, within him, Baal began to rage. His smile quickly extinguished. Tal Rasha began to scream with pain.